Today is Thursday, September 19th, 2013, and this is the start of an interview with Dick Gooding at his home in Shrewsbury. I'm Nancy Clark, interviewer for the Oral History Project of Hopkinton, and this interview will become part of Hopkinton's verbal memories and history for current and future residents. Dick grew up in Hopkinton after moving to Elm Street in 1951 at the age of 6. As an adult, he lived in other parts of the country and then returned to Hopkinton with his family in 1985. Dick, I wondered if you could begin by telling about your move to Hopkinton and your recollections of life here in the 1950s.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today, Nancy. My dad passed. I grew up in Needham, and I was born in Needham, as was my older sister Nancy. And in 1948, quite suddenly, or well, not quite suddenly, but my dad died at age 39 of stomach cancer, and my mother was working in the Needham Town Hall as a social worker. And shortly after my dad passed away, she transferred to Framingham, where she was given an opportunity to be a social work supervisor, and hence she decided it was time to move out of Needham and perhaps buy a house. We were in an apartment in Needham. And so somehow she came across Hopkinton as a sleepy little town of, I think it was less than 3,000 back then. This is 1950, 51-ish. And wound up buying a house at the corner of Elm Street and Wood Street, number 1 Elm Street, which is kind of a ramshackle old house built in the 30s, I believe. And we moved there at the end of the school year. And I was a first grader and my sister was a 5th grader. And my mother wanted to get into school, or get into Hopkinton, at least to give us a week or so of school, so we'd know a few people. And so off we went to number 1 Elm Street, which is, again, my mom's first house purchase, along with my stepdad, Larry Smith, with whom I grew up in Hopkinton as well. So in 1951, we showed up in Hopkinton, and I remember my mom bringing me up to Center School. There were only 2 schools at the time, and that was Center School and the old Hopkinton High School, Stedgy Prep, or whatever people want to call that old brick school in front of Carrigan Park. And off we went. And grades 1 through 8, I believe, were in Center School. And it was in the midst of being one first renovation and a number of renovations later. And a scary part of entering into Hopkinton schools was I went into school as a first grader, and it was the end of my first grade year in Needham. And I can remember my mother and the principal bringing me down to the lower level of Center School in the back into Mrs. Smith's class. And Mrs. Smith, an old town name as well, wife of Brown and Smiths from the Brown and Smith fame. And since they're all gone, I guess I can tell this without much fear of retribution. I walked into the class and Mrs. Smith wasn't there, and the kids were all sitting there, and the principal, and I forget, it might have been Bob Nealon at the time, who then became the town clerk and part of the Nealon clan that has been so involved in the community for these many years, said, Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Smith peeked out from they had little bathrooms in between classes for the younger kids in case there were accidents. And she was in there spanking one of the students who was a state ward. It was really made a huge impression on me. And for that last week of school, I was a model student. I was an absolute model student. But the thought of such a corporal punishment, which seemed to be pretty regular back then, thinking of it today, I'm sure she would have been hauled out in shackles if that happened. But that's a memory that I take with me for years and years and years about coming to school in Hopkinton. But getting into Center School was just a delightful experience, and again, it was a very, very small town. I think there were 2 first grade classes and two of each of the classes, about 20 students per class. And you sort of tracked along, you had the same, stayed with the same group as you were going 1 through 6. While I was there, the school expanded Hopkinton got slightly bigger and built what was then called the new high school, which was a junior, senior high school, now the middle school. And that was grades 7 through 12. And that opened, I think, in 1958, somewhere in that neighborhood. Because I know my sister was the last, she spent her first 3 months in the old high school, Stedgy Prep, and then was transferred, I think, as a 7th grader. But the schools, they were just nice. We just really enjoyed it. And we found, both my sister and I found that we weren't behind Needham, and Needham was considered to be a real bastion of education. And we found that neither one of us, of course I was in the 1st grade, what did you do in 1st grade? Other than, I think, cursive, they were working in cursive, and I think I was still printing at that particular point in time at the end of the 1st grade. But my sister found that she was able to make a pretty smooth transition, and I think we both came away feeling, as did my mom, that the schools were very, very good even back then when there were such tiny classes. But Hopkinton back then was a kinder and gentler place to live, and I think my mom looked at Needham when we left Needham as being, and she grew up in Needham, she was born in Needham, and I think this was sort of a page being turned for my mom, and moving to the little town of Hopkinton, which she served as a welfare director, because she worked her way up to welfare director in Framingham, and which encompassed Hopkinton as one of her territories. But I think she really looked at that as starting anew after the passing of my dad back in 1948. And 3,000 people, I think, was actually under 3,000 people, and I know we bought the numbers are maybe a little fuzzy, but I think my mom bought the house for the princely sum of $15,000 or something, maybe even a little less, I'm not sure. But it was a great place to live. And the thing I recall about as being a real young kid and growing up through before high school is that most of Hopkinton was really divided into neighborhoods, and they were truly neighborhoods. Now, they were much expanded from what a neighborhood is now, which seems to be a cul-de-sac and houses all sprouting off. But living on Elm Street, the entire Elm Street, which at that time, of course, was well before 495, went about a mile from Wood Street to the dirt road, which later became South Street. And Elm Street passed where High Street is today, where, by the intersection and the 2 gas stations, it became a dirt road at that point, and there was a turkey farm down the end of that. Holt's Turkey Farm was on there, and as a kid, and I know my sister worked down there plucking feathers, but all the kids, and it just seemed to be an awful lot of kids, and I guess we were all post-World War, the end of World War II babies, and we were all growing up, and every house had 2 or 3 kids going up Elm Street. And you got to know everybody in your neighborhood, and with little baseball games, it was the Elm Street gang, and and some of the notables that I could recall as a kid growing up. Sandy King Altamura, that a lot of people know because she's been heavily involved in the town for years, was a neighbor a few doors up, and those are the only ones I can think of. The Fairbanks families, which are still very much rooted in town, the Wilcox families. And Mr. Doyle, and a lot of people know Aubrey Doyle, a retired teacher and athletic director and coach. His family lived right on Elm Street as well, maybe 10 doors up from me, and they had a mink farm, and in his backyard. And that was always sort of a mysterious place, and we really weren't able to go there. Not you know, Aubrey was a little bit older, so it wasn't like he was a friend or anything like that. But we did used to go to their farm, and they had cows, and then they had these big mink sheds in the back. At that time, they were building the Tennessee Gas pipeline, the big pipeline that goes in behind Elmwood School, and that was sort of a big event for the town, and it sort of changed really the makeup of the town. And one of the things just after they opened that is they had spotter planes, little fixed-wing planes that used to fly the pipeline with some sort of devices to make sure that there weren't leaks. Well, I guess the first time this spotter plane went flying up and they fly real low, it wound up scaring all the minks, and and these were silver minks, which I guess are more valuable than other minks, although, you know, maybe that's not PC enough. We should be looking at faux mink coats, but I can recall that all the minks died, and that was the end of the mink farm, or most of the minks died. But there were a lot of farms right on Elm Street, and there were farms all over town. But there would be, the point was, there was the Elm Street gang, and then there was a generic gang called the Woodville Gang, which we, you know, affectionately called the Woodville Indians, and they were always the wildest ones. And that encompassed all of what is now Woodville, although most of the houses were around the post office proper within a half-a-mile radius, and the outer limits, really there weren't many houses around Lake Whitehall at that point in time, other than summer cottages and the infamous hotel, for which I think had burned down long before then, with healing waters or things of that nature. But that was one of the gangs, and then there was the East Hopkinton gang, although again it wasn't as highly populated as some of it. And then of course Lower Hayden Row, and they even had different sections. I think they called it Skunk Hill, and which was closest to Milford, and then farther up there, and then of course there was the lake, and Lake Maspinock at the time was really just summer cottages, and maybe a handful of homes, year-round homes, but almost exclusively summer cottages. And I guess from Boston, people come there from the summer. And West Main Street, really there weren't many cars that went on West Main Street. And actually West Main Street had to yield as you were coming into town from West Main Street. At the time in the 50s, you had to yield to 135 traffic coming up the hill, because that's where all the traffic was, Hopkinton, Woodville, Westboro, and nobody really went farther west than Lumber Street, which was called Tunnel Road for those people who went down to Lake Maspinock. And the rest of the road going up there, and of course none of the homes on School Street and around the lake, none of those homes were built then. And School Street was a dirt road in both directions, both going towards Woodville and then going towards Milford and Upton. So they yielded, and you know, the thought of that today, well, of course that, you know, that changed with the building of 495, but I don't know, that was kind of one of the things that I remember as a kid that changed as we came back.
That's great. What about, it's really interesting, how so many roads were dirt and so forth. What do you remember about downtown?
Downtown, it seemed bigger, but then again, maybe it was because I was so much smaller. You know, I think there have been pictures shown of diagonal parking, and that was the way the cars were parked. Certainly, Brown and Smith was considered to be the focal point of town, and the meeting place of most the family, or most of the men would go up there at 5:30 in the morning. I think they opened at 5 o'clock. And swap war stories about who caught the biggest fish that particular time. The town hall was next door, and that again, there were very few people in there. The services weren't as abundant as they are today. But an interesting thing is we had two downtown grocery stores, and which was, you know, for a town of 3,000 people, you say, what's the point? Well, it was very different. We had right about where Hopkinton Photographic Images is, and the country store there was Finest, which was Colola's. I think it's Finest or First National, which was the beginning of Colola's store. And down at the bottom of the hill, right by Hopkinton Drug, where their big parking lot is on Main Street, was Woody's Superette. And that was owned by Walter Wood and Evie Wood. Walter Wood was a teacher for years. He was a retired military man, and he had a son who was my high school class, who I'm getting to see tomorrow night at our 50th class reunion in Hopkinton. And I don't know how people decided they were going to shop at which store, because they both had about the same things, but my parents were very close with Walter and Evie Wood, and they went to couples club together, and they played penny poker together, and so we shopped at Woody's Superette for no apparent reason why we wouldn't go to Colola's. But that was kind of unusual for a little town like that. And the post office is where the gas station is, the Exxon station is, and where Colola's Market is today was the town barn. And that was sort of the town barn being the DPW of today, and meeting of great social minds at the town barn next to the fire station. And so the town, and there was a drugstore. Actually wound up being two drugstores at one point in time. One was became Katz's, which was has been there for a long time, and the other up the hill was Day Pharmacy, which was owned by the Murphy family, and who's there's still Murphys around here. Fred Murphy, it was his dad, and that they're still in town, and that one of them is my classmate as well, Judy Murphy. And so there were two stores there, or two pharmacies, which today we have one, well, essentially one, but I guess now the Price Shop is probably a pharmacy as well. And there were other there was a shoe store and a few other things, and a 5 and 10. There was a 5 and 10 cent store, but it seemed to be, I think, people use the downtown probably more than they do today, if that's the proper way of describing it. And a big trip would be to go to Framingham, and you didn't do that all the time. Now we look at that as just a reasonable commute, and certainly no one would go to Boston and Milford. Well, maybe the people on Lower Hayden Row, but the center of town was where everyone shopped. And of course, 3,000 again, that didn't make for many crowds.
And any other, again, sort of in your younger years, recollections of celebrations in town or parades or?
Well, the parade that most comes to mind, although it wasn't really a parade, was the muster, the firemen's muster, and it was done in the summer, and I'm not sure if it was on a holiday, and it may have been the 4th of July, and then morphed into the Horribles Parade. I'm not sure of that exactly, but the firemen's muster was down on Winter Street, where Farrer's, where they do work on fire engines, and it was a much bigger facility then, by bigger or busier, and it was a very active manufacturing site. And they would block off that whole road, and people would park across the street up in the big field where they used to have the bonfires. Herman Lager's field with the bonfires, and it would have these firemen, and these old fire trucks would be dragged in from all over Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and it would be for a couple of days where they'd have events with their fire hoses, and they'd have races and all that, and that was a big event. It was a huge event. I'm trying to think. I can't remember when the Horribles Parade came into being, since it's been determined that the McIntyres were involved in that. I assume it was probably in the 50s as well. And certainly the most noteworthy thing about the Horribles Parade was the beer truck. And I think it was probably a McIntyre's flatbed. And there would be a number of local town officials, and of course everyone who owned a store was a town official of some description. But they would have a beer truck up there, and old John Smith, one of the partners of Brown and Smith, would be sitting up there in a lawn chair, and there would be a couple of kegs of beer, and they'd actually spray beer into cups, and the kids would come up to the beer truck during the parade. And this is while the parade's going on, and they're going up Hayden Row, Pleasant, Grove, all the same local streets right in downtown. And they'd run out with cups. They weren't solo cups, they were probably paper cups of beer, and hand them out. These are the little kids would come running up there, and they'd spray beer into the crowds if there was a lot of beer coming around. And of course they have, trucks dressed up with floats, and they'd have people riding horses. And Hopkinton was extremely rural back then, and certainly South Street was part of Patton's farm. Most of the place that is now developed, a gentleman by the name of Willard Patton had a cow farm there, and he sold out when 495 was built. And you may know, Nancy, but I can't remember quite when 495 was built.
Late
it was in the 60s, mid 60s, maybe after I'd left to go to college and break out of Hopkinton for a hiatus. But those two things I recall, and then of course the marathon, but was always a big event. But in its early days, it wasn't as commercialized, and they didn't succumb to commercialization until they realized in order to attract the elite runners, they needed to pay. And initially, the marathon, which was always a BAA event, but I think John Hancock got initially involved in it. But they used to get a bowl of beef stew and a crown of thorns, and that was everyone got the bowl of beef stew that finished in Boston, but the crown of thorns went to the winner. And of course, the winner was only a man, because women weren't allowed to run until the great, Rosie Ruiz event back in the 60s as well. And as kids, we would run in the marathon, and you say, well, what? And I can remember one time, and I couldn't have been more than 11, maybe at the oldest, maybe 12. 4 or 5 of us were up at the marathon. They said, "Oh, let's run," So we all ran, and I had soft shoes on. I guess they called them hush puppies back then, with soft soles. And we ran and ran and ran, and got to Framingham, and my feet were hurting, and I looked down, and I'd worn holes through my hush puppies. So that's when we stopped. That's when I stopped, and I wouldn't have been able to run to Boston anyways. But of course now they have bandits, or which they have, but there were never more than 1,000 people running the race back in the early days until it really became commercialized. But that was it. The event was big for a small town, but not anything like the event is today. Although it's always been a worldwide event.
Could you go on maybe to your middle school, junior high, and high school years when you moved up? I guess you never went to Stedgy Prep, right? You started at the new high school.
No, one through six was in the center school. I do remember we had a fire in the center school at one point, and I'm not sure what grade I was in, and we wound up. Part of the school was taken out of action to be fixed, and we had split sessions in Hopkinton, and I think for a year while they were fixing the building, and then the buildings had a number of expansions. Since I moved in '51 here, it did have the back wing, but not the full back wing. So it had been expanded from the original school, which is the front brick side. But in '58, when they opened up the 7th and 8th, and I assume the 7th and 8th must have been in there as well. I don't think they could have gotten them all in Stedgy Prep. But the classes were very small then. They were in the 20s and 20 to 50. My class actually was 54 by the time we graduated, so that was a pretty small class. So I think we were one of the smaller classes. They began to grow shortly thereafter. But school was, again, you wound up staying with the same group, grades 1 through 6 in this case, until we moved up to junior high, and that was the big new junior, senior high school, and they tried to keep the high school kids from completely integrating with the junior high kids. Although bullying wasn't much of a thing, but there was some of that too. But I guess it hadn't been properly identified at that particular point in time. But the middle school, going to middle school, of course, was a big new adventure because you wound up with different teachers, as opposed to one teacher for almost everything, which is what we had in 1 through 6, with a music teacher and a writing teacher. There were few people, but you essentially stayed in one room. We started moving around in rooms in 7th and 8th, and that was always quite a big event. And then seeing the high school kids was a huge deal. And going into the school as a brand new school is also kind of fun, and almost, most everything that was there was brand new. I think the school never had more than probably 250 in the high school, and then 125 or so in the junior high, and the junior high was always 7 and 8 at that point. I don't think it was some of the middle schools now are 6, 7, and 8, and I'm not even sure what it is today. But the school was was a small school, and it was associated with by the athletics to find the groupings of peer schools, and it was some of the same local suspects that we deal with now. Of course, Hopkinton and Ashland have been rivals and approximately the same size towns, and one will get ahead of the other, and I guess we're now significantly ahead in population from Ashland. But Ashland was a peer school. Holliston was, although Holliston was quite a bit bigger at the time, and Millis Medway. All the schools were sort of east of Hopkinton. Westboro was sort of not really a peer school. They were a little bit bigger, although we played them in football before I got into high school. But the schools were identified that way, and Southborough became Algonquin. I don't know when that happened. That happened because Northborough had a high school, and I don't think Southborough did. And then Northborough became Algonquin, and they became quite a bit bigger than us, and we stopped playing them in sports. And the sports, of course, back when I was in high school, the sports you could count on one hand. And, for the boys, they had football, basketball, and baseball. We didn't have track, didn't have any of the other more exotic sports by today's vernacular. I can remember Francis Moriarty, who later was a teacher and a driver ed teacher, started the golf team back in, I think it was 1959 or 1960. And we had 3 kids who were really good golfers, by those standards, were quite good golfers, and they were the motivating force behind them starting a team. And they had to scramble to get 6 players, which was the complement needed to have the thing. And as an 8th grader, I used to go with my stepfather over to St. Mark's and play a little golf with him. And even though I liked baseball and that was going to be my sport, I made the golf team as an 8th grader just because they needed a 6th person on the team so they could field the team. But that was the first adventure outside of the standard sports. And for the girls, they didn't have field hockey at that particular point in time, and so we didn't have soccer in either male or female. I'm not even sure there was a fall sport for the girls, and there was basketball and softball, and I believe that's it. Although it would seem like they might have had, maybe they had field hockey. I don't know. But Miss Harris, Marion T. Harris, a legend and a teacher that I learned to really love, even though she was a mean, brusque-looking babe, was the coach of the girls' sports, and she ran them like military organizations. And some of the historical teams, both basketball and softball, were legendary. She went undefeated a number of years and had girls who went on to play in college in both basketball and softball, and she had some really, really spectacular teams. But again, there were very few sports offered for the small school. So much more opportunity today, and to differentiate, from what I know and what I've seen the schools develop into, the opportunities are significantly greater today. Academically, we essentially differentiated with college course and commercial course. And the commercial course were for people who really didn't think they were going to go to college. It might be bookkeeping and some skills that would allow somebody directly going into the workforce out of high school. And I think they had a general course, which was sort of a hybrid of taking some college courses and some commercial courses. And then the commercial group, we had no AP courses of any description. You know, about the only thing you could do would be to try to take an elective that might be a stretch. It was interesting, when I was in high school, we had about 6 languages, or 5 or 6 languages offered, and it was primarily due to one teacher who's still around, kicking around, lives in Milford, and his name was Paul McCormick. And Paul McCormick was in the Army and was a language instructor at Monterey Institute out in Monterey, California. And he spoke Italian, Russian, German, and Spanish. And he started classes in all of those languages. I'm not sure how they handled the money back then, but they were very, very small classes. French and Latin, not even Spanish, were the 2 primary languages, foreign languages, and anyone in the college course took 2 years of Latin, and then probably 2 years of French, and some people they offered 4 years of Latin were offered and 4 years of French were. And Russian, they tracked one class and then opened up a second year. German, I think, was taught for a year, and in Russian, I can remember a friend of mine was in a class of 3, and the thought of being able to afford a teacher to teach 3 people was rather, I don't know how they did it, although I'm sure those same teachers taught world history and taught Russian and a number of different things. But there seemed to be a lot of flexibility in the educational process, as I recall, going through high school. But I think I think most of us who went on to college found out that it was a rude awakening when you found out that Hopkinton High School, which we thought was good, and I think it was very good with a basic education, but some of the kids that you were competing with in college had classes that we thought were only available to college kids, and the concept of accelerated programs and advanced programs had yet to catch on. So I think the kids today have much greater opportunity, and those old folks like me who say, oh, well, it was good enough for us then, and all that crap is just that. And we're very happy that we were able to all get through and go on to college for those of us who did. But I think the opportunities today, academically and athletically, for the kids in Hopkinton are significantly different and better.
Yeah. And how about social activities when you were a teenager? What was there to do in Hopkinton, and was it organized by the schools, by the town, by churches?
I think
what do you
the
remember?
most significant, and the same problem that you hear today of nothing for the kids to do was part of what I recall growing up. And I think that's where the neighborhood activities became a pretty significant thing, and you really did things in neighborhoods. And the Elm Street gang, we'd be playing baseball today, we'd be playing football tomorrow as 8, 9, 10 years old. The teenagers had one significant social event, and that was called Teen Canteen. And Teen Canteen was a dance. It was held on Saturday nights in the Congregational Church, the lower of the Congregational Church, which is now the Korean Church, and it was called Eldridge Hall, and it was after some founder of it. It was church-based, and it was the Congregational Church, I think, made it available, and it sort of supported it. and they sold Cokes and things at this dance, and they had a high school kid was the spun records, and it was a big event for junior high and high school, not for elementary school, but they would have a junior high dance once a month, and then it was quite often during the school year they held them. Every week they'd hold a dance, and a lot of the high school kids would go to that. Other than that, there were active Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops that were available to kids, but there weren't many social opportunities. The YMCA certainly wasn't there over in East Hopkinton back at that point in town, and I think the school became the hub of most of the activities, whether it's athletics or some of the clubs that they had, and then Teen Canteen, and then in the summer, Lake Maspinock. A lot of people would go who weren't going off for something. They'd go out over to Lake Maspinock, and there was a store there called Penny's store right in the parking lot of by Sandy Island. And they had jukeboxes in there, and the kids would go over there and spend the day, ride their bikes down and spend the day down at Sandy Beach. And that was probably a big summer social event. But there were limited social opportunities, and anything we wanted to do, like movies, you'd go to Framingham for the most part. There were 3 movie theaters in downtown Framingham, and some people would go to Milford where they had movie theaters. But I think most social activities were pretty limited in surrounding the school.
And do you remember anything about sort of your parents' generation, what they did in Hopkinton for social activities, and also maybe what a lot of your neighbors' parents did for work?
Yeah, from a social standpoint for the parents, a lot was the churches, the 2 primary churches in town, which at that time were the Congregational Church and the Catholic Church. The Episcopal Church was there, but much smaller. And a lot of the social activities surrounded the churches that you went to. As an example, there was, and this is again, I believe it was sponsored by the couples club, by the Congregational Church. There was a couples club, and they got together and had events in the church and had a potluck supper, had minstrel shows, if you can imagine that today. And that seemed to be tied together through the church affiliation. I don't think that we were more church-going back then than people are today, but that seemed to be a common denominator for some of the social activities. The Kiwanis Club was down where the Islamic Center is today, and that was a sort of an active group, and the Masons, the Freemasons, just the Masons then were right next to where they are today, and next to the Korean church and the restaurant there. But I think that they were limited, and I think that most of the parents at that point in time were focused, because everybody had kids. There weren't too many, I don't think there were any single parent, well, there weren't, and there were families, and there were very few single parents, as I recall. There were a few, but very, very few. I think that was an anomaly. And as far as where people worked, I don't think, very few people traveled all the way into Boston. There may have been a few, and most of them, a lot of people went to Framingham for work, and what they might have done. I guess as a young kid growing up, you're not cognizant of what your neighbors do for work as perhaps they are today. I know my stepdad was an optician. He had an optical shop on Route 9 in Framingham. And my mom worked for the welfare department in Framingham for her entire work career. But a lot of the moms were stay-at-home moms for sure, and much more so than today, as I recall. And again, my memory might be might be a little bit foggy, but I guess other than like Walter and Every Wood both worked in their own grocery store, so I know what they did, and they were very close friends with my mom and dad or stepdad. But it was I don't know, whole different situation.
Well, you mentioned that there were a number of people that were farmers.
Absolutely, and a lot of the kids had the opportunity to work on farms. I know the Mezet family, and this is the Wally and Ed, who were the parents of Wayne and Roger, were at that time, along with their grandfather, Peter, who founded Weston Nurseries, was certainly a big hub of town, and many of the high school kids, when you were looking for things to do in the summer, many of us went down to Weston Nurseries to do very menial work for 25 cents an hour, following a donkey, hauling a cart that we had to throw rocks into as they were clearing fields for cultivation. And so many people worked, and many people worked on some of the milk farms, and there were 3 or 4 milk farms in Hopkinton, Hayden Row, Wood Street. They were all over the town, and a turkey farm, and that was another place. I know my sister worked plucking feathers out of the turkeys at Holt's Turkey Farm, and it seemed like the kids had lots of opportunity for doing things during the summer primarily, and some of them worked worked afterwards. I think most of the retail stores that are in the downtown, I think the workers were more older. They didn't really hire the younger kids very much, and not like they do today. And of course there was Brown and Smith, and there weren't many coffee shops available. There were more bars certainly than coffee shops in Hopkinton at the time. It seemed like there were quite a few bars. Some were probably even legal, and but it was an interesting situation. I think that the biggest thing that sort of changed things was 495. Even that I think has really upped the ante and made Boston accessible, and has spurred the growth that we've seen in the 80s and 90s in Hopkinton.
Yeah. And then, so I know you went off, after you graduated, you went off to West Point, and you were in the military, and then you began your career, and you were gone for, 15, 20 years, I'm not sure exactly, and then you came back. And can you just comment a little bit about that, since you have the perspective from the earlier days of coming back here with a young family yourself?
It was a very interesting experience, and I told Judy I didn't think I really wanted to come to live to Hopkinton. And in my world, my business world, in the printing industry, and printing and packaging, I transferred within companies, or within a company a number of times, and then changed companies a number of other times, and ultimately wound up winding our way after being in Chicago and Louisville, Kentucky, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Connecticut, and we wound our way back to Boston, and I had a job in downtown Boston, right next to Fenway Park, in the printing business, and we were moving from Connecticut at the time, and I said, "Geez, I don't think I want to live in Hopkinton." Judy's parents were still here. My mother was living in an apartment in Framingham, and I said, "I don't know if you can go back." And we were looking in places that would be a reasonable commute into Boston, but Hopkinton was one of those. And we have a summer house on Hummerock Beach on the South Shore, Situate and Marshfield. And Duxbury's always been a favorite town of mine, and I thought that might be nice. And so one morning we were at Hummerock, and I got up at 5:30 and got out on Route 3 at 6 o'clock in the morning and tried to drive into Boston. And I said, "Geez, I don't think we're going to do that." So we continued to look around, and then ultimately we wound up building the first house in Valleywood over on the west side of town. And when I was at work one day, Judy went out and bought the lot and bought the plans that went along with it, and Ron Nation built his very first house we moved into, and he was our next door neighbor. And today Kim, my daughter, or our daughter, lives in the backyard, in the house right in the backyard of the house that she grew up in.
Yeah, it's interesting. So just any sort of overall changes?
The changes to the town when we moved back, I think had been dramatic. I think at the time there was probably from a 3,000 where it was when I was in school here in town. I think it was probably shy of 10, but it was probably 7 or 8,000. So it had doubled in size, and all that growth was primarily out in the outskirts, the community, or the outskirts of the subdivisions that we see today. And of course, South Street had come online, and although that was in the early days when we moved back in the mid-'80s, and I can recall I got involved. I'm a political hack, and I've always been a lifelong Republican in a Democratic state, although I wasn't always in a Democratic state, and got involved with the Republican Town Committee, and was talking on a car phone, which was one of those big old things back in the '80s, coming back from Boston, talking to the chairman of the committee, and I said, gee, I think I'd like to run for something. And she says, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm Dick Gooding. I grew up in town and moved away, after I went to college, and now I've come back and I'm raising my kids. I'd like to get more involved. And I said, but some of these committees, this planning board and all these committees, they're really hard. You have to know something. I really want to try to do something where you don't have to know anything. I said, how about selectmen? And she laughed, and the next thing I know, I was running for selectman. And from a unique position of being both a hated townie as well as a newcomer. And when we moved back to town and built our house, we became actively involved with the newcomers group, where we first met Nancy, and where we've been lifelong friends since the '80s, when we all both moved to Hopkinton, and a lot of other folk. And our kids all grew up together and went to the schools together. So I was both a newcomer, and yet I was also a townie. So I thought I was dreaded by all, but as it turned out, it probably was very helpful as far as getting involved in local politics, which I did in the late '80s for one stint, and then came back and did it again after we had moved away again, and then came back. So there've been more going away parties for our family than we can even count. And there'll be another one. We'll be back again at some point.
It's given you an interesting perspective, being a townie and a newcomer as well. Yeah. Well, it's been very interesting. I think the last thing I just wondered if you had any comments on were your children, Jim and Doug and Kim, growing up. They went to school other places also, but then came here and they were still in school. Any recollections you have of their being affected by the fact that you were a townie, or teachers possibly remembering you and your wife that they had? I'm just curious.
Yeah, they all had some interesting experiences, particularly Jim and Doug, who were in high school when we came back. And at the time, they had a handful of the same teachers that Judy and I had growing up in high school, and seeing our names and some of the plaques around the buildings and some of the things that are involved. I think I don't know if that was intimidating. I'm sure it made them feel good, but it did make for interesting things for all of them. Yes, they moved around quite a bit, and in the end of the day, I hope it's been a more positive experience than a negative experience. I grew up my whole school years in Hopkinton, and my kids probably, Jim, the oldest, probably went to 6 or 7 different communities to go to school. But it was good that all of them sort of finished at least their high school years in Hopkinton and relate to being from Hopkinton. Kim, of course, returned to Hopkinton and lives here now and is raising her family, and the others are a little bit farther away, but I think they still very much relate to their experiences in Hopkinton as a fond experience indeed.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Your insights are very valuable, really interesting to listen to. This is the end of the September 19th, 2013 interview with Dick Gooding. The interviewer was Nancy Clark.